Okay, so we're going to be talking about hominid brain evolution. So to begin, the article was found in the journal Human Nature, and it focuses on the research of Drew Bailey, a graduate student at the University of Missouri, and David Greery, who's a curator's professor, also at the University of Missouri in the Department of Psychological Sciences. The article itself and additional research by Greery are focused on how brains of hominids have evolved over time, how various social and geographical factors have affected the size of hominid brains, and finally, how the various species of Homo have different brain sizes. So, for more background, we have on the left a Homo habilis skull, and these would be an example of what would be analyzed. This is about this skull itself is 1.8 million years ago, but the species itself 2.8 to 1.5 million years ago. And on the right is the Ndutu skull from Tanzania, which is estimated to be around 500,000 years old. So the question is, how have hominid brain sizes evolved? More specifically, how factors such as climate conditions, ecological demands, and social competition influences change in brain size. So for the data on cranial capacity, it was obtained from papers by Gallup from 2007 and Ruff from 1997, and the cranium used dates to around 10,000 to 1.6 million years ago. The paper by Gallup also provided data on oxygen isotopes in order to provide help with understanding paleoclimates. The latitude of each skull were provided by estimates by Ruff and Gallup papers, and the numbers correlating to the parasites were obtained by Beaver, Jung, and Cup, and were based on how many skulls in the regions had parasites present. And for each location that the skulls were found, the paper used Kanazawa's mean temperatures for the area, and then used BBC weather's highs and lows to determine annual temperature and variability, and population density was estimated from where the skull was found and other information that they had present. And this is just an example of the raw data. We have the fossil number, the cranium capacity, which is in centimeters cubed, latitude, longitude, all the way up to population density.
Okay, so for the results that they found for the research, so correlations among cranial capacity and predictor variables. So the table at the bottom shows that each of the predictors correlates significantly with cranial capacity, but each predictor correlates significantly with other predictors as well. And the correlations in and of themselves do not provide evidence for the unique contribution of any single predictor for the evolution of hominoid cranial capacity. So homogeneity of variance, so latitude and age are significantly correlated. However, a regression predicting the latitudes inhibited by hominoids from fossil ages generates a heteroscedastic distribution of error. So the absolute deviation from predicted values increased with the increase in the predictor variable. So what they did was a Brown-Forsyth test, which compare the error variance between the observations that fall in the first half of the predictor's range and with those that fall in the second half of the predictor's range. So what they found is that some of the hominoid individuals remained close to the equator while the others migrated through the north and south over time. So multivariate prediction of change in cranial capacity. So a fourth predictor regression model with age, population density, and their quadratic components was specified to determine the most useful of these variables in predicting cranial capacity. And what they found is that population density and its quadratic components, they contribute more unique information about cranial capacity than that of age. They also found that latitude, parasite load, temperature variation, mean temperature, they're also closely related. But also latitude is the one that is least specified. That is, it cannot be selective pressure in and of itself, but rather is a proxy for climate and ecological variables that change with the latitude. And compared to parasite load and temperature variation and mean temperature, they're better specified in that they can be selective pressures in and of themselves, and they can co-vary with latitude. So a regression confirmed that each of these variables is associated with the unique variance in cranial capacity, and that these variables, they do not cause latitude, but they do change significantly with the changes in latitude. And thus are the potential mechanisms underlying the relationship between latitude and cranial capacity. So as for the image on the left, this is a relationship between cranial capacity and the variables. So for the first panel, it shows that cranial capacity increases continuously from the lowest population density in the sample to about 1 standard deviation above the mean population density, and that declines slightly. The second shows that cranial capacity increases with the increase of the oxygen isotope variation. And the third one shows that temperature variation and cranial capacity, they have a similar relationship, that when temperature variation increases to the mean of this variable, so does cranial capacity.
All right, so to move on to the discussion of the article, there were 3 different variables that they looked at that had an effect on the increase in the brain size, and because they're not mutually exclusive, it was hard to determine the effect that each one had. So what they did is they controlled for different variables in order to figure which one had the biggest impact. And so the first thing that they tested for was the climate, and they found that climate basically doesn't really have that much of an effect on the evolution of the human head compared to population density, and that even though it did prior to, so they tested the fossils up to 1.9 million years ago, but beyond that they found that it did have an effect, but if you look below that point it actually didn't, and so because of that they found that that wasn't really a big contributing factor. The next thing that they tested was the ecological hypothesis based on the parasite load. Their basic thinking, or way of understanding this, was that if you have different hominoid species moving away from the equator, it would get colder, and so there would be less parasites, and so because of that their immune system wasn't going to be using a lot of energy to fight off different pathogenic bacteria, and so because of that they could use that energy to build a bigger brain. But they found that when they did their test, there wasn't any significant correlation between that, which made them move to the idea of the population density being the major factor. And they found that, or their reasoning behind this idea was that, okay, when the population towards the equator reached their carrying capacity, they had species moving outside of that region. And when they moved outside of that region and they became more sophisticated at taking advantage of the resources that were available to them, they were basically shifting the pressure from an ecological pressure to a social pressure. And so the people that were more skilled at hunting, and the people that were more skilled at getting food and so on and so forth, were the ones that were having the bigger brains. And so over time the bigger brains is what led to this increase. And so if you look at the global increase in brain size, it makes sense with the population density hypothesis because of the fact that there would be a within species arms race that happened. So basically the conspecifics would be competing between each other for resources in their region, and the ones that were the most intelligent at getting food and so on and so forth would be the ones that would be displayed in the environment, or displayed in the population. So in conclusion, they found that with their studies, population density was the biggest contributing factor to the increase in the brain, even though the other factors that were tested were also semi-contributory to the change.